How are you going to respond to the person in front of you? And then we'll also talk about a skill set that I developed, adapted somewhat from the work of Daniel Siegel and others, that really tries to get at how do we position ourselves as skillfully as possible to be able to respond effectively to someone who's dealing with trauma. So part of what made me so passionate was 10 years ago, seeing how much trauma needed to be part of the conversation and wasn't in the mental health world at the time. And I haven't seen recent studies, but it was sort of anecdotally shared in mental health that the average person with PTSD would receive 4 incorrect diagnoses first before someone landed on the right one. I don't know if I think that's still true, but I certainly think that trauma looking like lots of different things still poses a challenge in the mental health world. And I think that, again, why I'm so excited about talking about this with DD and dual diagnosis is we've made huge leaps. And this network in particular is really, active in bringing everyone along in this conversation. But of course, there's always more to do. So thank you again. And I really, really value and appreciate the time that we get to spend together talking about this. So without further ado, Anna, if you can jump us 2 slides ahead to those quotes, we'll go ahead and start with that. We'll be moving through this kind of quickly so that I can allow for time for Anna to change slides and all of that fun stuff. But I do have to start with these quotes because they really set the stage for so much of what we're going to be talking about today. So the first one I need to explain a little bit. Tamsin Cottis may or may not be a name you're familiar with. She's actually a therapist and a clinical director in England. And her clinic in London specialized in working with people with developmental disabilities, which I think is amazing. Even in a huge city like Chicago, I don't know of any mental health clinical center that only works with people with DD. I think that would be amazing. But anyway, when talking in her book about trauma in particular, this is what she had to say about people with developmental disabilities. It is worth noting at this point that many patients referred to her clinic seem to have become disabled more by their traumatic life experience than by any congenital impairment. And that is so powerful. I've quoted this in my presentations for years and years, and every time it's new all over again for me, thinking about the impact of what she's saying, that we're used to, if I am referred to your agency or your county or whatever, the first thing people talk about is what is my syndrome? What is my IQ? What support levels do I need? Blah, 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 all of which are great and important. But imagine how services in Illinois would be different. In some cases, I think even just opposite, if you started with, what is my trauma history that is known? What if we don't know a trauma history specifically, what does everyone know about what helps me feel safe and what makes me feel scared? And when do I seem triggered and when do I seem shut down? I feel that this is more and more a part of the conversation, but if you look at what Cottis has to say about this, it should be the beginning of the conversation. I don't think that's quite where we are. But the real point of this, I think, is how impactful trauma really is. And we tend to still think of it as kind of a branch of that tree. And I think we might reconsider that. So the next one, and again, this is a group that we love coming back to and talking to. I know we have a lot of trauma involved people, trauma educated people. So for some of you guys, this will be a familiar name compared to some other audiences. Bessel van der Kolk, for those of you who are, just kind of beginning in your trauma learning, is probably the most recognizable name in the world for treating trauma, researching trauma, and writing about trauma. And in fact, his most recent book, I think he has a new one coming out soon, but his most recent book from 2015 was actually something that I used as a textbook when I taught in the OSU MSW program, when I taught trauma. It's written for a general audience. I cannot recommend it highly enough. It's called The Body Keeps the Score. And this actually is from a training that I attended as he was releasing this book. In fact, the past is the past. And the only thing that matters is what happens right now. And what is trauma is the residue that a past event leaves in your own sensory experiences in your body. And it's not that event out there that becomes intolerable, but the physical sensations with which you live that become intolerable. And you will do anything to make them go away. Now, he has packed so much into this paragraph from this training that I feel like I need to break it down with you guys a little bit. The thing that I think is so critical about all of you being here is not just so that you know more about trauma, but because so many of you are going to be translators and bridges for family members, for staff members, for multidisciplinary teams where people don't get it about trauma. And I think the single biggest stumbling block is this idea of past and present. That if we think about trauma, as many of us do, understandably, that it's something that happened in your past, then it's unavoidable that people, whether they're conscious of it or not, kind of have this feeling of, why don't you just get over it? You know, why don't you just let it go? And I will not sing that song for you, so don't worry. You know, we really think that if you can just sort of let go of the past, everything will be cool. What I think is so critical about this is van der Kolk is saying, yeah, it's really not about the past anymore. It's the fact that your nervous system, your brain and body are now reacting to things as if they're still happening. And that is the problem. So just if there's nothing else that we talk about today, there are so many of you right now that are positioned to help people kind of get that it isn't about trying to make this person get closure or let it go. It's about helping them re-experience safety over and over again and helping them understand, maybe, or helping the people around them understand that their brain and body is reacting to something as if it's still happening. So focusing on closure or getting people to let it go really is missing the point. The other thing that he talks about, I think, is the fact that it's in your sensory experiences in your body. And this is so important because of how so many of our individuals live. And in order to explain that, I'm going to tell you a story. So when I was in college, I had a professor who grew up actually in rural Ohio, not unlike some of the areas where some of you guys are from in Illinois. And when he was a young man, he volunteered for military service in the Vietnam War. So he went to Vietnam and he was a medic. And his job every day for a year was to jump into a helicopter, fly to where there had been fighting. Hopefully, you know, the firing was done, but often it wasn't, and they were at risk for being killed. Running up to grab the soldiers, dragging them back onto the helicopter as quickly as they could, and trying desperately to keep the soldiers alive on the flight back to the medical base. I will not describe to you what he described to the class about what the inside of that helicopter on that flight back was like. But that was his life for a year. And then he came back to Ohio and finished his education and became a clinical social worker and eventually a professor and married a nice lady. And one day he and his wife decided to go to the movies. And they went to see a movie called The Deer Hunter. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with that movie, The Deer Hunter was one of the first very realistic, very graphic depictions of the Vietnam War. And the way that my professor told this story for generations of students to come was, one minute I was sitting in the movie theater, PhD, sitting next to my wife, and I can't tell you what was on the screen at that second because that information isn't available to me. All I know is the next thing I knew, I was crouched in the middle of the theater aisle, screaming, incoming, while my wife and an usher were dragging me out of the theater. Now, let me ask you all a question, and we're just gonna be really honest for a minute, okay? I want you to imagine that instead of being a PhD clinical social worker, that my professor was an individual with developmental disabilities and he was there with his group home. And in the middle of the movie, he leaps out of his chair, is crouched in the middle of the aisle, screaming, and has to be physically dragged from the theater. What would this individual be told as soon as they got home? Let's all just be really honest. he would be told, well, you're not going to the movies for a while. In fact, you've got some consequences coming, right? Because of your what? Poor choices, your bad behavior. Maybe they get a behavior plan, blah, 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 right? Okay. You didn't know my professor. He's gone now, actually passed away, but you'll have to take my word for it when I tell you that he did not choose to terrify his wife, disrupt a theater full of strangers, and be humiliated as he's dragged out, physically dragged out. Of course, he didn't choose to do that. In fact, as we talk a little bit more today, what happened to him neurologically was so fast that it was probably closer to like seizure activity than it was a behavior. Why? Because in my book, behavior is something that we decide to do. If I raise the cup of tea, it's because I want tea, right? If I were doing this training with you guys and I suddenly fell to the floor in a full grand mal seizure, none of you would be confused and think, gosh, she's choosing to behave very oddly right now. You would understand that that was out of my control. In fairness, if you don't know my professor's story, he just looks, we can be honest again, I know the word that I would use, right? If I were in the theater and some dude just started screaming and had to be dragged out, I think I would probably say to myself, wow, that dude seems crazy. Thank you, Melissa. Yes, crazy. That's the word. That's the word we would all at least think, right? Part of the problem with trauma is that if you don't know the story, the behavior is so, or the presentation, I should say, is so out of sync with everything else that you don't know what to think. Now, the difference here is that my professor, after a few seconds, as he got reoriented, was able to, at least explain a little bit and reassure everyone that he was back, in his right mind, so to speak. But if you're an individual where perhaps speech is difficult at the best of times, or you've experienced so much trauma that it takes a long time to reorient and reintegrate, if communication is difficult for any reason, then it just makes no sense to anybody. And when you have a developmental disability, people tend to look at everything as behavior. It's all a choice. In fact, if that individual in our example has sometimes been challenging for staff, they're maybe even going to use the M word. You're being manipulative. You're being attention seeking, or whatever thing it is. Let me not get started. So the point here is that one of the things we will talk about today is not developmental disabilities trauma as if it's some different flavor of thing. As far as we know, the body and the brain and the nervous system only have a limited number of ways to react to a threat. And I have yet to see any research that suggests that having a developmental disability significantly alters how your brain processes fear or how your brain releases adrenaline. What does seem to be the case, what does seem to be the difference is how people are supported and treated if they happen to have a PhD and a professional career versus if they have a developmental disability, right? So again, why this is so important is because you people may be the person who goes, wait, whoa, whoa, whoa. Before we assume that this was a conscious behavior or a deliberate choice, maybe what we're looking at is a fear reaction or a trauma reaction, and maybe we should treat it more like that, where someone is supported and helped to feel safe, connected, and in control again, rather than punished as if this was a decision they made. Okay, I could go on and on, but the last thing I want to say about this, yes, okay. So as I saw him do this training, he was, of course, looking at the audience as he was saying this, and he said, you will do anything to make these intolerable sensations in your body go away. And he just looked at us. And in fact, I think that of all the things in this paragraph, and there are so many really important things going on, the most important word in the whole thing is the word you. He did not say, if you're a messed up vet, or if you've got some problems, or if you just don't have a strong character. He said, you will do anything to make them go away. And what that means is lacking the appropriate supports and understanding, I will do anything to not experience that level of terror and being overwhelmed. I would, let's see, drink, use drugs, compulsively shop, gamble, have sex with inappropriate people, starve myself, overeat, undereat, cut myself, burn myself, bang my head, you name it. If there's something I can think of that will make that stop, I will do it. And so will you. And that, again, I think is why it is so critical that you may be the person who helps people see that while this person's presentation may look very, very different or even alien to us, we are much more alike than we are different. And that in the right set of circumstances, any of us might be doing those same things to make that level of terror stop. My guess is for many of you right now, there's some people that you're thinking about that you're currently working with or that you've worked with in the past, or people from other areas of your life where suddenly the context might look a little bit different. That maybe what they were doing was not manipulative or attention seeking or just bad, but maybe it was an attempt to blot out or control uncontrollable levels of terror. And then finally, the quote that is in some way the simplest, but also my favorite, because I think it's so elegant. Pierre Janet, just for a little context, was a 19th century French neurologist, and he and others did some of the foundational work for what we now understand to be trauma. And he said this: trauma is a disease of not being able to be here. And I think with all of the suffering and difficulty that trauma can bring to people, in some ways, this is really the heart of it. That the real tragedy of trauma, when it goes unrecognized and unsupported, is that we miss our own lives. We can't be in our own lives because we are constantly out of sync with what's going on around us. And depending on our situation, like the individual in our example, we might be experiencing consequences or punishments or isolation or what have you, because trauma is keeping us from responding in an organic and appropriate way to what's going on around us. So with that as our context, we are going to go ahead and jump into some slides. Anna, if we can go to the next slide. This is kind of exciting because I don't really remember what the next one is. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on this. We're going to pick up a little speed here. So I'm not going to do a lot with diagnostic categories or definitions, but I will just say that trauma is anything that overwhelms our usual coping system, right? So any experience that feels like we might be about to die or experience injury or pain or be emotionally overwhelmed can be potentially traumatic. This is really important because there's some events that if we find out someone experienced, like if I told you guys that I experienced a plane crash and survived a plane crash, you'd be like, oh, that seems pretty stressful. And if I told you that I had some PTSD or that I had, some panic attacks with the idea of flying or whatever, you'd kind of get it. But the problem is that we start to look for the event in someone's life. And if we don't see an event that we would consider traumatic, then we sometimes stop thinking about trauma as a possibility. So if I told you that I had been in a near-death experience in a plane crash, that would make a lot of sense to you. But now I want you to imagine something really different. I want you to imagine that I am 4 years old and I live in a household with a lot of violence. There's a lot of intimate partner violence, a lot of screaming and throwing, the police are called, et cetera, et cetera. Now, for whatever reason, no one ever hits me. I am never physically harmed. I'm never in any danger of being physically harmed, as I obviously was in whatever it was, the plane crash. But would you think that being 4 and seeing all of this and hearing all of this might be emotionally overwhelming to me and maybe even emotionally annihilating? Yeah. Absolutely. And in fact, some studies suggest that when you do brain scans of things like soldiers who've been exposed to combat PTSD scenarios, active combat, when you look at slides of people who've been in 30-year intimate partner violent relationships, or children who've experienced, I think one of them was sexual abuse, when you look at the regions of the brain, the changes in the brain look similar. So the brain really doesn't make a distinction between I was really in danger of dying versus this was emotionally overwhelming or annihilating for me. And especially, again, as our friend van der Kolk says, when there's a feeling of helplessness or paralysis. If I'm in, let's change the scenario a little bit. Let's say that I'm in a car accident and my car rolls into a ditch, but I'm able to unbuckle myself and climb out to safety quickly. Might I have PTSD from that? Sure, absolutely. But now imagine the same car crash, the same accident, whatever. But this time I'm scrunched into the car and I'm trapped and I can't get out and it takes them hours to cut me out. And I think that the car might catch on fire at any moment. Is that a greater potential for trauma? Absolutely. So we also look not just at the experience, but also was this person able to do anything about the stressor or the threat or the situation they were in? Which should make you think again about the people we work with. How many of them are in stressful, potentially traumatic situations that they can't change or that they can't easily leave? Okay, so next slide. I'm going to go through these very quickly. The thing is really this. The other thing that people get kind of snagged on is looking at triggers. And this makes sense, right? So if I am, let's say, a staff person and it's Anna's my individual and I'm starting my first day of work and I brought Timbits for everybody and I'm all excited. And Anna has at some point in the past been frightened by a petite woman with long dark hair. And the first thing she does when she sees me is hauls off and punches me in the mouth. Well, okay, obviously there's a lot that's going to happen. And one of the things that's going to happen is this is going to be noticed as a trigger. And it gets triggered by petite women with long dark hair. So maybe we shouldn't staff people with, little women with long dark hair. Okay, that's not a bad place to start. The problem is people sometimes get really focused on, okay, now we need to figure out what all the triggers are and track them down and make sure that Anna doesn't get triggered. There are two problems with this. The first one is, if you've ever worked with people with severe trauma, you know this already. Sometimes we don't know why someone is triggered. Sometimes we don't know why we ourselves have been triggered. Sometimes there are obvious things that we can identify. Sometimes we can't. The example that I use with the clients I see in my practice is, it's like a smoke detector in a kitchen. And one time you burned toast and it went off. And now every time you cook something, it's a little more sensitive and a little more sensitive. And for some people, the smoke detector is so sensitive that it's almost like it kind of sets itself off. So maybe you're in bed and it's the middle of the night and that smoke detector is going off. Who knows why? So if we over focus on identifying triggers, we can sort of get led down some blind alleys. The other problem is this, and Anna mentioned in the introduction that you guys are doing more and more sophisticated trainings around trauma and trauma treatment. That would be a longer conversation for another day, but if we ever do talk about trauma treatment, one of the things I'll talk about is when you're working with someone to help them heal from trauma, you kind of need them to get triggered sometimes, not in an out of control way, but you're trying to help the brain experience something different. So if you were working with me and somehow you made it so that I was never, ever, ever, ever triggered, actually my brain never gets to experience a different ending on it, if you will. So again, that's part of a different conversation really, but suffice it to say, triggers are not where you want to get snagged up, right? When you're thinking about how to support an individual. A better way to think about trauma is that depending on the trauma, depending on how severe it was, how early it occurred in someone's life, how chronically it happened, then trauma can affect everything about who someone is. I guess we're going to go back to the ocean for this, but a good analogy might be if there's a leak in a boat. If it's, just one little area, then at first maybe just a little water comes in, but given enough time, that water is going to go everywhere. It doesn't just stay in one little place. So the point about not getting caught up with triggers is you really need to see how it can affect everything about who someone is. And these are just a few examples. If the feelings connected to being triggered in trauma are unbearable and overwhelming, like my professor screaming in a movie theater, then chances are I'm going to spend a lot of time and energy trying not to feel things. And I may even feel separated from my body in order to do that. When people have experienced severe, long-term or early trauma, or especially all of the above, they often don't feel very connected to their body. They don't know very much about what's going on with their body, which makes sense. If I'm going to try to shut down scary feelings, I can't pick and choose what I feel and don't feel. So I kind of shut down everything. Um, this can make me look, among other things, sociopathic. When I started my career, I worked a lot with teenagers. And I think teenagers are the pineapple on pizza of human beings. They immediately put people into two groups. You either like working with teenagers or you don't. And I'm one of those weird people who really, really likes it. And I will tell you that one of the problems with trauma is we look at different people differently. And some people we look at as being vulnerable, and some people we don't. So, for example, when I worked with teenagers who were boys, and especially boys of color, in Columbus, it was typically Black boys, then if they had experienced the numbing and the disconnection of trauma, that can make you look like you lack empathy. And if I'm already predisposed to look at that young person as criminal, as opposed to vulnerable or injured, then I am halfway towards diagnosing them with what? Conduct disorder, if they're under 18. And that's just a little jump to antisocial personality disorder once they're adults. And now we've got them on that criminal track. So if I sound upset about this, it's because I am. Not everybody gets to be diagnosed with trauma, sometimes because of how we feel about them. And if we look at people as a threat, and especially for young people, once they hit adolescence, they stop looking cute and they start looking like a threat to many of us, then we start diagnosing with oppositional defiant, explosive, disruptive behavior disorder, which I don't even know what that would be, conduct disorder, on and on and on and on and on. So if we really start understanding how pervasive trauma can be, then we also start seeing that our definition of who potentially could be suffering from trauma starts to get bigger. Let's just jump to another one because I could get really dug in on this one too. Yes, let's look at the second bullet here. How you fall asleep, digest food, and fight off disease. Yep. Many of you are familiar with the term hypervigilance. We'll talk about it just for a moment in a little bit, but essentially it just means your radar is on high alert all the time, constantly scanning your environment to see if something is going to be a threat or triggering or whatever. And that's exhausting. That is being flooded with cortisol and adrenaline most of the time. Many of you have worked somewhere at some time with somebody where people pulled you aside and said, hey, by the way, when you work with Lara, just make sure that you don't come up behind her and tap her on the shoulder before she sees you, because if you do that, what? I'm going to turn around and punch you in the mouth long before I've looked to see who you are, right? Think about how many places you've worked where there's a power struggle about bedtime. People have trouble falling asleep. They wake up through the night. They don't want to sleep in their rooms. Why might someone not feel comfortable enough to fall asleep in their bed? Maybe bad things happened in bed, right? It was a constant in the different residential settings where I worked that kids wanted to sleep on the couch in the staff office or in the living room, not in their room. And I don't think I fully understood all the different reasons for why. Some of it might be associating bed with something dangerous, but some of it also is that the system in our brain and body that lets us fall asleep and stay asleep is very sensitive. It doesn't take much stress to knock it out of whack. Some of you might have noticed this over the past 2 years. So when we are dealing with somebody who has trouble with sleeping or who fights going to sleep, someone who has, let's say, tooth clenching or constant headaches or digestive issues, if we're not considering all the different ways that trauma can be affecting a human being, we may not be looking at these things and really getting the full picture. Or worse, again, we treat it like, oh, you're just complaining, or, oh, you just want to get out of the workshop and go to the nurse. And we're not thinking about the fact that years of severe stress may really have affected this person's nervous system. So if you go back and look at these two slides, you can see, we don't have to go back, but you can really see all these different examples. We don't have to go through all of them. Suffice it to say that at the right levels of stress, everything about how we see ourselves, how we see other people, how we relax, how we sleep, how we eat, our immune system, whether we experience the onset or worsening of chronic or autoimmune disorders, all of these different things, whether we look like we have empathy or we look like we're sociopaths, all of these things can be affected by traumatic stress. So again, when you are working with teams, or when you are working with an individual, or when you are talking to a family, part of what you can bring to the table is helping people understand that trauma can touch everything about who someone is. And if someone is able to get trauma therapy or is in a supportive setting where they can start to heal and connect to other human beings again, some of these things that we diagnosed, or some of these things that we just know are true about Lara, well, some of those things might start to change. I saw a number of young men where once they were treated for their trauma, stopped looking like sociopaths. Not all of them. I think we still have sociopaths sometimes, but it also teaches us that maybe we should hold all these diagnoses that we get in someone's file a little lightly, right? Especially if trauma is being underassessed or underconsidered. Okay, let's go ahead to the next slides, and I'm keeping an eye on when we will be taking our break. I think we're going to take the next 5 minutes and talk about different kinds of trauma, and then we'll stop there for a little break. So this is a list of what is sometimes called big T or capital T trauma. That might be a term that you've heard. And really all that means is it's so life disrupting that potentially it only has to happen once to cause some problems with traumatic stress. So in that example of, what was it? Some crazy thing I said. Oh yes, if I survived a plane crash and I told you that I had some PTSD from this, you wouldn't be confused. You wouldn't say, oh, what, just one time, one plane crash? That would do it, right? So things like sexual assault, physical assault, verbal or emotional abuse or manipulation, war, natural disaster, catastrophic illness, severe humiliation and bullying, all of these things, we kind of see these things and we get it, right? So the good news about this is that if you were working with an individual and you happen to have in their history that they had experienced sexual assault or physical abuse or whatever that might be, I think we as a profession are getting better at looking at that and saying, this person might be dealing with some trauma. The problem, the trap there is, compared to the typical population, the individuals we serve are more vulnerable to some of these kinds of trauma, particularly interpersonal trauma or exploitation. They have higher rates than the general population, but they're not always reported and they are not always believed, which of course is true for other people as well. But especially if I have a developmental disability and someone is, let's say, exploiting me, it's pretty easy potentially to make me feel like I can't tell or I'm going to be in trouble. It's also, unfortunately, pretty easy for me to try to tell someone and to be minimized or not believed. Or if I have difficulty communicating, which is why someone might target me in the first place, then how do I communicate that? And there's another problem as well. When I worked in the kid world, I don't know if I have any kid people out there. I hope I do. I think we're a special breed. When you work in the kid world, there's a little bit of a luxury that I didn't understand until I started working in a different world, which is you often have some kind of history that's fairly recent. Somebody knows something about what went on in this kid's life, usually. But how many of you out there working in DD work with people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s? One of the nice things about developmental disabilities is that we are learning more and more about how to effectively treat medical problems that people have. And we have longer lifespans for many of our individuals, which is great. The problem is things that happen, let's say early in their life, or especially childhood trauma, which is more impactful generally than what happens in adulthood. Who knows? right? Records may not even exist anymore, or God knows where those things went. They could have been raised by wolves. We have no idea. So one issue that we're going to talk about when we come back from the break is we are getting better at knowing more about what to look at in someone's history and to see some of these big T traumas, right? We're getting more sensitized to that, but there's going to be a lot that we miss. And that's not even the only problem. Let's go to the next slide. We're going to go through a couple of these, Anna. So keep going, keep going, keep going. Okay, go one more. There we go. Okay. We're going to talk about this and then we'll head into our break. I want everyone to look at this list for a second. Feeling different than other people, not being accepted by a group that you're around, not being able to do something other people seem to be able to do, moving to a new home or having a significant change in your living situation, not being listened to, feeling misunderstood, failing at a task. If I just left this slide up like this, you might look at this and think, well, why is this in a presentation about trauma? Because after all, I could have put the heading on this slide, 7th grade, right? Like if we were all in a ballroom together, I would have you guys raise your hands if any of you had never experienced anything on this slide ever in your life. Nobody would raise their hand because some of these things happen just by being a human being, right? This is just stuff that happens to us sometimes. So why are we including this in a conversation about trauma? Well, the previous list was about things that were so disruptive, so extraordinary, that even just one time could radically expose us to so much stress that it starts to change how we experience the world and how our body processes stress. These things are not about severity, but about repetition. So let me give you an example. I want you guys to look at, let's say, failing at a task, okay? And I'm not going to ask anyone to volunteer this, but I want you to just take a minute. If you're taking notes, put your pen down, just sort of think about this for a second. And I want you to think about a time in your life that you failed. And I mean, really failed. And maybe it was something important to you. It wasn't like, I guess water skiing's not for me. It was something maybe you cared about, or you really tried, or maybe other people saw you fail. How did that feel for you? I can't see you guys, but if I could see all your faces, I know what I would see. I would see a lot of you going, oh. I already know something about you guys. What I know is that you don't like failing at all. And if we had time to talk about how you managed failure in your life, I know what I would hear. I would hear it was hard, but I relied on the people around me for support, and I tried again, or I found a different way or found different strengths or whatever. You probably have pretty robust strategies for how to handle that when that happens to you. The reason I know that is because all of you have really important, responsible jobs. So I already know that you're good at not failing, and you're good at figuring out how to come back from that when you do. Now think about that feeling you had, but imagine that you don't have that support system, and you don't have those strategies to try again or try a different way. That perhaps this happens to you, let's say in a classroom where your needs are not adequately supported, day after day after day, after month after month, after year. Those of you who work with older individuals, how many times a day, a week, a month, a year, a decade, have those people felt overwhelmed, misunderstood, not being heard, not being listened to? I don't think we can count that high. So the issue here is not that the event itself every once in a while would be something we would call traumatic. Most of us probably wouldn't. It's the repetition over and over and over and over and over. So with big T trauma, the trauma might be about intensity. With little T trauma, it's about repetition, especially for individuals where there's fewer supports and fewer strategies to feel successful. Okay. A friend of mine is a retired lieutenant in the Ohio Highway Patrol. He specializes now in training first responders in trauma. And he likes to say that big T trauma is like being attacked by a bear. You see that damage right away, right? That can be pretty dramatic. Little T trauma is more like being attacked by ducks. Every once in a while, a duck here and there maybe is something you can deal with, but given enough time and enough ducks, and that damage starts to look the same. So when we come back, one of the challenges that we're going to address is how do we deal with trauma where there's big T trauma and we're not always going to know about it, and then there's little T trauma where I don't even know if anyone's figured out how to measure that yet. So here's what we're going to do. I think this is a good stopping point. I'm going to take just a second to glance at the comments, and we will take our break, let's say at 3 o'clock, and we will come back at 10 after. Gosh, so many good comments here. La, 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 la. Okay, I do have to call this out from Terry O'Gara. I think I'm probably not saying your name right. Love working with teenagers and love pineapple on pizza. Terry, we have to hang out. Yeah, let me see if I have any questions. These are such great examples. Here's one question I'm going to pull out. How do you differentiate between manipulative behavior and behavior coming from trauma? I'm probably not going to say this correctly. Elpidio, we're going to come back and talk more about that. But I think the first thing I would say is we have to decide that manipulation is okay. Because I want you to think about what that word means. The word manipulate literally means use my hands to make the environment work for me. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to give people whatever they want whenever they want it. And it doesn't mean that we don't work towards helping them find a better way to get their needs met. But the very first thing we do is I kind of don't care if someone's manipulative or they're behaving from trauma. What I care about is this person is trying to get a need met. How do we make that need okay for them to have? So that's easy to say and very complex to do, but let me just put it to you this way. When someone is identified as attention seeking, the very first thing we tend to do is try to figure out how to not give them attention. So the very first thing we would do is shift the conversation to addressing this in a different way. That's where I would start with that. So it's a great question. We're going to come back to that. Let's go ahead and take our break and come back at 10 after, and I will see you guys then. Sorry about that. Just to say that it can get really sticky when you've got multiple things going on to try to do that. So it might be more helpful just to figure out what are the supports that seem to work with this person and not worrying about the causation so much, if that makes sense. And Wayne asked, is there a way of doing EMDR with people in DD? There is. Actually, there's a growing amount of research about what happens when you do various formulations of EMDR with people with developmental disabilities, and the outcomes seem statistically similar to people who are neurotypical. Okay, so given the amount of time that we have, I am going to jump ahead here because we've talked about trauma as both big T and little t, and we've talked about why it doesn't make sense to think that we're always going to be able to catch all of that. So there is a much bigger push in DD to be looking for trauma, to be looking at histories and assessing for it, and I think that's great. But given the two kinds of trauma we've just talked about, we already know that there's going to be some of it that we miss. So when we are talking about how do we apply what's going to be helpful in terms of understanding trauma, then what I think might help is to think about what is trauma all about? Trauma is about feeling unsafe and out of control. So what makes sense then is that no matter what kind of trauma we're talking about, when someone's brain is reacting in that I'm under a threat way, we'll talk about the structure of the brain in a minute, it makes sense to think about how does someone feel safe and how does someone feel in control? If trauma is about being unsafe and out of control, then we need to think about how do we do the opposite of that? In order to do that, let's talk about what's going on in the brain and body. Okay, so we're actually really changing a lot about how we talk about structures of the brain and what happens here and what happens there, but that's not really important for our conversation today. What might help is to think about, if you look at the brain like your hand and you think about a lot of the functions of the body, digestion, how fast your heart is beating, blood pressure, standing upright, muscular coordination, things like that, tend to happen at the bottom of the brain here, what we would call the brain stem and kind of the bottom of the limbic system. Okay. Older formulations of the brain used to call this the reptile brain, because if you think about what reptiles do, this is how they spend most of their time: eat, sleep, poop, make more reptiles, kind of it. Then if you look at the middle of your little hand brain here, kind of where your thumb would be in your fist, then this corresponds roughly to the limbic system that many animals have. We tend to see a bigger, more developed limbic system in mammals and primates. And the limbic system is involved in lots of different things. But one of the things the limbic system does is it sorts through all the information coming into your brain all the time. You can sort of think of it as a little way station. And that information can be things that are happening around you, like your senses, right? What you see, what you smell, what you hear, what you taste. But it can also be information from inside your body. How fast is my heart beating? How fast am I breathing? We'll talk more about that a little bit later on. And so it takes all of this information and it's constantly checking the environment to figure out what's going to happen next, and are our systems go? Are things okay? And the answer is at any given moment, either yes or no. An example of that might be something like when, let's say we're all sitting here in our offices and suddenly there's a loud sound and it's the fire alarm going off. Well, the first thing that would happen is you'd probably startle, right? Your heart might speed up a little bit and you would orient to the sound and look around and try to figure out what's going on. Now, let's imagine that for some reason that I can't imagine, Anna at the beginning of our recording today said, oh, by the way, we're going to do a fire drill in the middle of this. So after a few seconds of your brain going, oh, and reacting to this, that's the limbic system taking in that sound and going, unfamiliar, danger. And then after a few seconds, you remember, wait a minute, Anna said there was going to be a fire drill a little bit after 5, whatever time it is for you guys there. And I think it's like heading towards 3:30. So, oh, right, I think this is a fire drill. And what would happen? You would take a breath, maybe try to calm yourself down a little bit, and then get up and walk out of the building or whatever you're supposed to do. What happened there was that loud sound did exactly what it was supposed to do. It got your attention and it kind of startled the limbic system. Specifically, there's a structure. If you look at your hand brain and you look at the little almonds, like if you imagine little almond shaped freckles at the 2 bottom corners of your thumbnail, that would be the amygdala. The amygdala is often involved in sorting out all the sensory information and deciding very quickly, safe, not safe, familiar, not familiar. So that loud sound would come in. It's not normally what you hear at work or at your house. And it immediately stopped everything to figure out, am I safe or not? Now, after a few seconds, your thinking functions, which are largely at the top of your brain. So if you look at your hand brain one last time and you see the back of your hand and the fingers coming down to the thumbnails, well, then we know that we have that access to the information that, oh, this is a fire drill. When you have a chance to choose how to act in a fire drill, what does your thinking brain tell you to do? It says you don't have to run screaming out of the building. Maybe just put your coat on because it's super cold and go outside and try to stay calm and not push anybody, and everything's going to be okay. So your limbic system reacts first to try to get you safe and maybe floods you with adrenaline. I don't know about you guys, but when there's a loud, startling sound like that, even if I'm kind of expecting it, I don't like it. And my heart rate really jumps and I feel a little shaky. And even though my thinking brain is reminding me, here's the context, this is okay, I find it kind of stressful until the alarm is shut off. You can imagine that if this happens over and over again, especially if I don't know when it's going to happen, I get pretty jumpy and my reactions get bigger and bigger. Now imagine that I've been in a house fire before. Instead of having that little jolt of my amygdala going, oh, this isn't safe, and I have a little bit of a reaction, now I have a huge reaction and I freak out. So when we talk about trauma is about feeling unsafe, what we're saying is that brain system, that alarm system in the brain, generally speaking, the amygdala, is getting something out of the environment that's making it go, wait, stop, we're not safe. And it kind of goes right into that protocol. If it's a little bit of an event like a fire drill, our thinking brain can kind of override that. But if we're at an intense state of fear, then it becomes harder and harder to do that. That's why, for example, it's really dangerous to scream fire in a crowded movie theater, because the more people get frightened, the more they panic, the more they panic, the more they stop thinking, and people can't orient themselves to get out, and they will trample each other. So you don't falsely yell fire in a crowded movie theater because people won't be able to think through the fear. Make sense? Okay, so when we talk about feeling safe or not feeling safe, we're really talking about when the alarm system in the brain gets turned on like that. And I'm going to give you guys, we're going to zoom ahead here a little bit, but I'm going to give you guys this slide to look at for what we're talking about. So that example that I gave of, I'm just sitting here quietly, I'm listening to this wonderful presentation, suddenly there's a loud, scary sound, and I react, and then I've got to figure out what to do. If you look at this band in the middle here, this is where most of us neurologically spend most of our time. So this white band in the middle is kind of normal heart rate, normal breathing, normal sweating, whatever is typical for us for being awake. We're not about to fall asleep. Maybe the top of that curve in the white is when, I don't know, what's a Chicago team? The Cubs are in a sports event of some kind, the World Series? I don't know. If that game is very exciting, then maybe you're heading towards the top of that curve, but you're still in that normal rate of functioning. When I get startled by that fire alarm, or imagine that I'm driving in the Chicago area, which I personally find terrifying, and there's some car trying to merge into my lane, and there's 2 feet between us or something, then I may go up into that state of hyperarousal. Hyperarousal just refers to how activated my nervous system is. So my heart rate spikes up, my breathing becomes maybe fast and shallow, and I'm into a state that we might more frequently call fight or flight, right? In fact, I think my next slide will talk about this. I think I want to go back to this. Okay, there we go. So fight or flight, there are only a certain number of things we can do. The first 4 things on this list are the things we do when we are in that hyper aroused state. Fight, we're all very familiar with, right? We're gonna fight the bear. Flight, we're gonna try to run away from the bear. And generally speaking, I would say probably, don't try to fight the bear. So everybody kind of knows that fight or flight refers to that adrenalized state. What's happened in that state is, let me go back to the slide for a second because I think this is helpful. When I'm up into that red zone, what has happened neurologically is my amygdala and something called the HPA axis, you don't need to worry about that, has signaled the release of chemicals in my brain, among other things, norepinephrine and cortisol. When my brain starts pumping out norepinephrine and cortisol, it also signals the release of adrenaline from the adrenal glands on top of my kidneys. So now my whole body is ready to fight or to run away, to deal with this threat to my safety, fight or flight, right? Now, there are actually 2 other things happening potentially in that state that we don't think of. Fortunately, they all have F's, so this is kind of easy to remember. The 4 F's are fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. We're going to talk about those last 2. So freezing is, the best example I can think of for this is we're still or frozen, but at a high state of energy. So imagine that you're driving and a rabbit darts in front of you. If you looked at the rabbit, as you're trying to swerve out of the way, you could almost see it vibrate with energy. It's very tense. And as soon as your car, swerves out of the way, boom, that rabbit's going to take off. So it's still, but it's very energized in that adrenalized state. Okay, so that's freeze. It's stillness, but agitation. Fawning is sort of the opposite thing. Fawning is, instead of trying to get away from the threat, it's moving closer to the threat to neutralize it that way. So fawning might include things like smiling, like appeasing or becoming placating or passive. It might mean being friendly or sexual or flirtatious. It's the same, it's still a fear reaction, but it looks different, and it's sort of a different protocol to try to, as I said, move closer to neutralize things. So any organism can do this. In many human cultures, females are already kind of socialized to do that. So we may see this more in people who identify as female, but not exclusively. So fight, flight, freeze, fawn, these are all the things, again, just to go forward for a second, these are all the things that we see in that hyperarousal, that red zone. We're activated to try to deal with the threat. Now, what's going on with this hypoarousal? Hypoarousal, just like it looks like, is the opposite end of that spectrum. So instead of our nervous system speeding up, if you will, what happens is it kind of shuts down. And this will happen in one of two ways. Either we've been in hyperarousal and we've been trying to deal with it or trying to get away or trying to fight or whatever it is, and it's not working and we can't get away and we're trapped and stuck. And then eventually people will go into hypoarousal. What I would see sometimes when I was in facilities that did restraints, which I hated, were that often people would become frenzied when they were being restrained, which is probably part of why it often was re-traumatizing. And then eventually, we would say like, calm down, calm down, calm down. But what would actually happen is they would go limp. Sometimes this was a strategy, but more often I think what I was seeing was people would go from hyperarousal to hypoarousal. When this happens over and over again, one term that we used to use for this a lot was learned helplessness. There's no point in resisting. There's no point in fighting. There's no point in trying to get away because I'm helpless and there's nothing I can do. When people have been institutionalized for a very long time, or the threat has been overwhelming for a long time, it's been a chronic thing, then they might not even go to hyperarousal at all. They might go all the way down to hypoarousal. We also see this sometimes if a threat is immediately life-threatening. About 2/3 of the population will go up into hyperarousal first. About 1/3 will go right into hypoarousal. So what does hypoarousal look like? Well, I don't know why this slide doesn't want to stay there. We sometimes call this a collapse state. So a good way to describe this might be to go back to that rabbit that we talked about. When the rabbit is stuck on the road waiting for your car to swerve out of the way, it's in freeze. It's still very activated and it's going to take off running. Now imagine that same rabbit, but it's been caught by a wolf and it's just limp in the jaws of the wolf. Even if the wolf drops it, that rabbit might just lie there, kind of passive. You can see that the muscles are limp and soft and the rabbit's just kind of checked out, which is common among prey animals because if they're about to be killed, they don't want to stick around for that. So it's stillness, but it's more like all the power has been cut. This is also when people may experience dissociation. Dissociation is a really big word that really just means two things that are normally connected together are now apart. So the extreme forms of dissociation we think of when we think of somebody saying, I lost time, I woke up somewhere else. If you've ever worked with people who have dissociative identity disorder, they experience a profound sense of dissociation, even in terms of being connected to a single sense of self. There are common forms of dissociation that we all do. If you think about a common route that you take home from work, then you're probably familiar with, you can be thinking about work and listening to the radio and thinking about what you're going to do when you get home. And you realize that you don't really remember the last 10 miles that you just drove. What's happening there is that your brain is so, this is such an ingrained experience that your brain doesn't need to devote much attention to it. And you can be thinking about all these other things and your awareness is separated a little bit. One of the things, if those of you who work with kids, that you may be familiar with when we talk about dissociating is a change in a sense of perception awareness, or an awareness of being located in our body. When I worked with kids, it wasn't unusual to hear a kid say something like, oh, when the bad thing was going to happen, I would just go into my stuffed animal, or I would watch it like it was happening to some other kid. So people will sometimes talk about when they feel like they're in that hypoaroused state, they may literally feel limp or numb in their body. Sensorily, they're just not experiencing very much. They may visually get a different picture of the room. I've had people say, it's almost like I'm up floating on the ceiling and I'm looking down at what's happening. So my sense of myself and my body is usually tightly connected to my body, and now these two things are dissociating. So what that can look like, we kind of know what it looks like when someone is in a fight or flight state, right? Because they're busy trying to run out the door, or they are busy trying to punch someone. Maybe they're trying to punch us, or they're just frozen and wide-eyed. Collapse and dissociating can look much more subtle. One of the things that you may have seen when you are dealing with someone who tends to dissociate is you can sometimes almost see their face like kind of go slack. Some people, their eyes will travel to one corner of the ceiling or another, but you can almost see it if you get to know someone a little bit. It's just like they just sort of check out. Now, some of the folks we work with also have neurological things happening, like the person from the question earlier today. And that could also be something like seizure activity. I don't want to say that every time someone's face changes, it's because they're in a hypoaroused state. But the reason I spend time describing what hypoarousal might look like is that, to go back to our slide here for a second, you guys know a lot of people who spend a lot of time in that red zone, and they get a lot of your attention, right? They get a lot of time, they get a lot of planning, because everybody wants them to stop throwing chairs at people or running out into the road or doing whatever it is they're doing. And that's as it should be, right? We do want to be really thinking about and really paying attention to how to work with that and support that. The problem, or the other side of that coin, I would say, is that it means that the hypoarousal people in your agency or in your county or on your caseload or whatever, those people can sort of fly under the radar. And I will tell you that when we do consultations and we spend time with an agency, we spend time with a county, somewhere in the country, often we will do case consultations or just conversations about people. And I hear a lot about, oh, Laura, the one who's punching people, the one who's throwing chairs, whatever. When someone says, oh, I just love working with Kevin, he's always happy and he's always smiling and he's quiet. Well, I'm suspicious about a couple of things. Depending on a couple of things like Williams syndrome, I don't really think any human being is always happy. What I think may be happening is I may be someone who's in a fawn state. Often fawn in this sense means to flatter, to fuss over someone, to be overly appeasing or placating. So I may be seeing hyperarousal that takes the form of fawning, or I may be someone who's kind of checked out and they spend a fair amount of their time checked out, but we don't spend a lot of time paying attention to Kevin or working on what's going on with Kevin because Laura's busy trying to punch people. So my point here is just, as you leave here today and as you're thinking about these two states, you may start to think about people that otherwise might kind of go undetected or might go under the radar because they're not doing the big fight, flight, freeze, fawn stuff. And in my next slide for this, I'm going to skip through some of these. This slide has been modified from a woman who wrote a couple of really good books about polyvagal treatment in trauma therapy. That again would be a conversation for a different day about trauma treatment. But the vagal nerve complex, just to describe it very quickly to you, is one of the 12 nerves in your head. And this nerve, the 10th nerve, the vagal nerve, runs all the way down your body, and part of it splits off and goes down the front. It connects to your throat and your heart and your lungs and your diaphragm, right up to about kind of like the top here, right? And then the other half of it splits off and goes down your back and then wraps around the front again to the bladder and the bowels. Excuse me. So why we care about this is that the vagus nerve, especially where it attaches to the heart, kind of acts as the brakes on your nervous system. Our heart is really powerful. And imagine that you drive a Honda, but somebody put a race car engine in that Honda. You'd kind of ride the brake a lot, because if you took your foot off the brake and the engine went as fast as it's built to go, it would go zooming ahead. The vagus nerve actually kind of keeps one foot on the brakes. And when we talk, you may have heard people described as having good vagal tone or poor vagal tone. That just means that, you know, the brake system works well, or the brake system is a little splotchy. So for example, the person with the question about the individual who tends to be, I think what you were describing was someone who gets very angry very fast. There's not a lot of, you know, it's either full speed ahead or not. There's not, you can't sort of ease your foot off the brakes with that person. So this is important because when people are doing polyvagal theory, they're talking about when someone is in their sympathetic nervous system, it's like the foot is off the brakes and the heart is zooming ahead, and we are now in the 4 Fs, right? So if you look at that middle row there, we're mobilized for action, we're flooded with adrenaline, our heart is pounding really hard, we're in fight, freeze, fawn, and we feel mobilized. This slide that I'm showing you is adapted from something that she uses in therapy, that I actually use in therapy with my trauma clients, learning about what does it feel like in our body, what feelings are we having, and what thoughts am I having when I'm in that mobilized fight, flight, freeze, fawn, hyperarousal state. When you're working with an individual, maybe if they can talk to you, they can start building some language for this. Or if it's someone where perhaps they don't have language, then it's something that you're observing. What does it look like when they're starting to get into that hyperaroused state? What does it look like when the foot is on the brakes and we're in, don't worry about the vagal stuff for this. Engagement zone just means we're back. I'll take you guys back for a second. We are back in that white zone, right? We are in normal limits for how activated our nervous system is. Our amygdala is scanning the environment and nothing looks like a potential threat. Nothing is triggering a memory of a past threat. So systems are kind of normal, steady state, right? So one of the things I do with my clients is, what does it feel like in my body? What emotions do I have? What thoughts do I have when I'm in that steady state or engagement zone? Engagement zone means that I can engage with my environment. I can interact with my world. How I do that as somebody, let's say, who is on the autism wheel might be very different than, let's say, extroverted Lara or introverted Kevin or shy Anna or whatever. But whatever is normal and comfortable for me, engagement zone means that I feel grounded, I feel present, and I can interact with my environment to whatever extent is typical for me. I feel safe. When I don't feel safe, then initially maybe I go into that mobilized, hyper-aroused, fight, flight, freeze, fawn state. If I feel that it is an overwhelming threat, then, or maybe I've been in the 4 Fs and I wasn't able to get safe, now I'm in that collapse state. I'm shut down, I'm dissociated, I'm checked out, maybe disconnected from my body, maybe just disconnected from thoughts and feelings. This is another way to talk about dissociation. If you've ever had the experience of someone telling you a very traumatic story. This happened to me when I was doing pro bono work with the refugee population here in Columbus. Some of the people that I worked with had experienced extreme forms of trauma, including being political prisoners and experiencing torture. And in those instances, They would come into the office. I would never, never ask them to start working directly on that. Typically, I might start with, how are you? Or how was your day? And very quickly, it was as if someone pushed play and they just started telling this story of what happened to them, with horrifying events. And they would describe it like they were talking about a trip to the grocery store. There would be no emotion on their face. There would be no emotion in their voice. Their face would be a little bit flat. And you could see that the information was there. They weren't dissociated in the sense of, like, they had no memory of it, but they were dissociated in that the words and the feelings were completely separated. Why is this important? Because remember what I said before, who we think of as traumatized sometimes changes based on how we see them. So if you are, let's say, working with some tough inner city kid, let's say it's a boy, especially a boy of color, and that boy is describing some things to you, but does it in that flat way, you might experience that and think, wow, that kid's really tough. Or, wow, that kid is heartless, or that kid has no empathy, or that kid has no emotion. You might not think that kid seems pretty dissociated from his traumatic experience. So again, part of what we're doing as we're really thinking about how trauma presents is it can change and perhaps expand who we include in that thought or in that questioning of, I wonder if trauma is a part of this picture. So now that we've talked about what safe and unsafe looks like neurologically and what's happening in the brain and body, now we can talk about how that manifests clinically when someone has been given a diagnosis, and how then we work with that with trauma responsive care. So I think I'll just do this briefly for those of you who find it helpful. We're not going to talk a lot about diagnosis, and I always have way more slides than I have time to go through. But let's go ahead and do this. When someone has been diagnosed with PTSD, there are 4 clusters that a clinician has looked at. The first one we've largely talked about, and that is when someone is on red alert all the time. And in fact, what we've talked about, what happens to the brain and body when they are flooded with adrenaline and cortisol all the time. So that hypervigilance really just means they have a hard time settling down. They're constantly scanning their environment. Some of the folks that you work with who, for example, don't like having their back to a door, always want to know where the exits are, have a lot of questions when there's a change in routine, things like that. Avoidance, this used to be called constriction, for people who've been doing this for a little while. And avoidance just means I am trying to avoid anything that is going to potentially set off that cascade of going into hyper or hypoarousal, because it's terrifying and horrible to be in those states, especially when it's extreme or if you spend a lot of time there. And so that might mean that I don't go outside. It might mean that I avoid new people. It might mean that I literally hold my body kind of small. It might mean that I make my life and my world smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller to avoid this. And one of those places where things can overlap is that can start being called rigidity. That can start being called OCD, because I insist on everything being in a certain way. And some of the folks we work with may also have OCD, or they may also experience, let's say, part of being on the autism spectrum is that they can be kind of rigid about things. That makes sense. But what we may also be seeing is avoidance from trauma, and the way that I feel in control. Trauma is about being unsafe and being out of control, is my world is very predictable and there's nothing new. So that can be a form of avoidance. Intrusion is what we typically think of when we think about trauma. And that is things like nightmares, flashbacks. What happened to my professor in that movie theater was he had a flashback in which his body was in a movie theater in Columbus, Ohio, but the alarm system of his brain was triggered by something he saw on the screen or something he heard, an explosion, and reacted as if it were happening right now. And we call that a flashback. This is one of the few symptom areas of PTSD where there's a medication that can actually directly impact it. Many people with PTSD can manage anxiety or depression. I'm seeing some comments about anxiety and depression with antidepressants or anti-anxiety medication. There's actually also a medication that for some people will decrease nightmares, prazosin. And it doesn't work for everyone, but for some people, it can provide relief from that particular symptom of PTSD. And finally, negative alterations in cognition and mood basically just mean you can feel pretty bad about yourself. You can feel pretty bad about the world. You can have a very bleak or narrow or pessimistic outlook on things, or a way of thinking about how you get your needs met when you've experienced trauma. So that kind of makes sense. So when people spend enough time or things are severe enough in that hyper or hypoarousal state, this is how we start getting the trauma symptoms that people think about when someone's been given a diagnosis of PTSD. Okay, there are a number of comments and questions here. Let me just check these really quickly. Nicole said, this sounds like anxiety. Wouldn't an ongoing medicinal route be an appropriate intervention? I'm not sure exactly how you're using the word medicinal. If you're saying prescribe antidepressants or anti-anxiety medications to target that, yeah, absolutely. But that's treating the symptom rather than the root cause. So I think that a good treatment plan for someone absolutely might include those things. However, what won't happen through medication is the brain has learned to associate, let's say, if anyone gets close to me, that's dangerous and I'm going to punch them in the mouth so they can't hurt me. That pathway in the brain, if you will, that sets off that alarm system, that nothing has happened to change that. So when we talk about the use of medication, we'll touch on this a tiny little bit at the end. I always think of medication as a tool in the toolbox, but it's really about the interactions that a brain gets to have over and over and over again, where there's a new pathway formed, a new association. The brain learns something different, if you will. That's what starts to change the pathway. We're jumping ahead a little bit, Nicole, but it's such a good question that I'm going to use it as a springboard. So your brain gets good at whatever you ask it to do a lot of. Think about driving. I'm assuming most, if not all of you drive. I know I've got some city folks, maybe not everybody drives, but if you think about when you first learned to drive, you weren't very good at it. You hadn't had a lot of experience. Your brain hadn't had many opportunities. What was that? What was this? How do I do this? How far away is that? And so it took all of your attention, and you were probably like on the steering wheel, right? And pretty tense about it. And then if you're someone who drives a lot, what happens? You have more and more and more and more and more and more experiences of driving. The brain is an experience dependent organ. Parts of the brain, especially in the cortex and in the middle of the brain, every time you drive, there's a little bit more information. And the brain learns how to anticipate more and more and more. That's why younger drivers have more accidents and have higher insurance rates. It's not because they're dumber, but their brain hasn't had enough experiences of driving to react quickly and appropriately. Once you've been doing that for a while, your brain gets better at it. There's some other factors as well that we won't go into, but so when you've done something a lot, your brain gets good at it and your reactions get faster and faster. Another word that we use for this is learning, and it's actually kind of miraculous. And I will spare you guys the details of what changes on the surface of the neuron from one neuron to another neuron to make it happen faster. But just trust me when I say the reaction time gets quicker and quicker, the brain gets better and better. It requires less and less attention to do it, which is why many of you can drive and put on mascara and yell at your kid and drink coffee and figure out where you're going and do all of that and still drive relatively accurately because your brain is really quick and fast and strong at it, which is great when it comes to driving. It's not so great when it comes to trauma. So If my professor had been in Vietnam and served as a medic for one day and had had one bad flight, you can imagine that he might go to that movie and go, ugh. Now, think about him having some terrifying, horrifying, disgusting experience, terrifying experience on that helicopter over and over and over and over and over and over and over. And his brain is going into that hyper aroused fight, flight, freeze, fawn state over and 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 over. Well, his brain gets faster and faster and faster, which is why, by the way, there are some individuals you work with who've experienced so much trauma early in life is worse than later in life. I'm going to give you an example as to why that is in a moment. And it's happened, it was so severe, or it happened so early, or it happened so many times that I'm not going to take you back to that slide, but if we went back to that slide with the red and the blue, once they're up in the red, let's say, they go up, it's easier and easier for them to get up there. It takes less and less to set them off, and it takes longer and longer and longer. This is also important. That emergency system, it's like a fire alarm system that you can't turn off. Imagine you had a fire drill, but you couldn't turn it off and it went on for hours. That's what it can be like for some people. And some of you work with people like that. You probably are already thinking of some people where you know that once they're set off, that's it. That's it, for the afternoon with that classroom or with, wherever they are, because it takes their brain a really long time to calm down. What's actually happened is the alarm system has gotten faster and more powerful. And the brakes, the part that looks around and goes, wait a minute, I'm in a movie theater, I'm not in Vietnam, is slower and weaker. Our brain gets stronger and faster of whatever we ask it to do a lot of. And so when we are talking about healing from trauma, not just managing the symptoms of trauma, and I shouldn't say just, that's a big deal. Someone, if you have the right antidepressant or the right anti-anxiety medication, and that keeps them from jumping out of their skin every 2 seconds so they can work on healing from trauma, that's great. But when we actually see healing from trauma is when the brain is having different experiences, and eventually those become faster and more powerful. An analogy that might help is this. I want you to imagine that there's been a ton of rain, and there's a lawn, and it's waterlogged. It's really, really, really soaked with water. And now imagine that somebody drives a Jeep over it. What's going to happen? Well, the tires are just going to really dig in and tear everything up. And then even after things dry out, you get a break from the rain and the lawn starts to dry, you're still going to see the tracks there. Well, you can think of the human brain as kind of like a lawn. And when we are young, the critical window is really 0 to 3. To a slightly lesser extent, 0 to 7. Our brain is doing a lot of changing and a lot of growing, and it's very plastic. That's why, for example, the best time to learn a language is when you're really young, and why some things like being a world-class violin player or a world-class ballet dancer, you kind of can't start when you're 20. You need that early exposure because the brain is very, as we say in neurology, very plastic. It's easy to have an experience and have that really imprinted on the brain, which is great when you're learning French, not great when you're learning that people are dangerous, for example. So what happens as we get older, unfortunately, is the lawn kind of dries out and it's harder to make an impression, which is bad news if you're trying to learn French when you're 40, but good news if your brain was relatively intact through childhood, nothing was overwhelmingly stressful, and then you have a single stressful event in adulthood. I know I'm kind of going the long way around, but eventually, Patty, hopefully this answers your question. So van der Kolk has been asked this question and has said, if you have somebody with a pretty good, stable childhood, and they have a single traumatic event in adult life, let's say a car accident, they may very well have PTSD from that event, but their prognosis for healing from the PTSD is better, not guaranteed, but better than, and this was Nicole's question. Patty, I'm getting to your question. Sorry, I just noticed that. The outcome is better because this doesn't sound like good news, but the lawn was a little drier. And imagine a lawn that's really dry and you drive across it, maybe tear the grass up a little, but it's not going to create that deep rut in the mud. So when we're talking about the brain, what we're really talking about with trauma is, again, whether it's because it happened early when the brain was very plastic, or it was just repeated. Even with a dry lawn, if you drive over it constantly, you'd start to see ruts and you'd start to see where the grass doesn't grow. And now imagine that it rains. Where does the water run? It runs down the rut. It runs to where it's easiest to go, which gets back to the question about the person who's manipulative. Are they being manipulative or were they traumatized? Either way, when they get stressed, they're afraid they're not going to get something they want or something that they need, or they feel unsafe or unstable or whatever it is, their brain goes down that same route of, this is what I'm going to do to get my need met. I'm not saying you reward that. What I am saying is we're all built to react kind of the same way to stuff. And this person's brain has learned this. So the first thing we do when someone is manipulative is help their brain calm down. Do you need attention? I'm going to try to figure out how to make sure you get a lot of it. Maybe not, oh, the only time I pay attention to you is when you hit someone. Yeah, that's a great way to get you to keep hitting people. But if I stigmatize the fact that you need attention, two things are happening. Number one, I'm missing the whole function of what the brain is trying to do. I'm working against what the brain is made to do, which is to get needs met and make the environment safe and predictable. Everyone's brain does that. Whether I'm labeled manipulative or not, our brains are built the same way. And we all need the same things, including attention. It is not wrong to need attention. It's not great if you punch people to get it, or I don't know, take your clothes off or whatever. Yeah, not great, right? We want to find easier ways for the water to flow the way we want it to go. So if someone is attention seeking, I want to make it easier for them to get attention, not harder. I know this is a crazy analogy, but let's go back to our lawn for a second. Let's say there's a rut dug in the lawn and all the water goes this way and it floods your backyard. I don't know. And you want the water to go a different way. What's easier? Pushing the water back or creating a new path for the water to go in the direction that you want? This is easy to say and hard to do. It's the first thing I want to acknowledge. But to go all the way back to that question about the manipulative or whatever, if I make it easier to get attention in an appropriate way, if I help them to see the world by experiencing it as safe and it's going to get my needs met over and over and over and over and over, then eventually my brain goes that direction more frequently. And over sometimes a long time, the grass will start to grow in those ruts and the water will go more easily that way more frequently. Under stress, that person's probably going to go back to their manipulative behavior. They're going to go back to what they know. That's just human nature. But the way that I deal with the manipulation is to stop calling it manipulation. And I'm going to start calling it trying to get their needs met. And I'm going to try to figure out how to make that easier to answer that question. Nicole, to get back to your question, medication can be a part of it, but we have to make sure that their brain gets this new experience of safety over and over and over and over. Patty, I'm going to answer your question in a second. But this conversation leads me to what is the terrible trap of trauma. The trap is this, you guys, that for most of the people we work with, the trauma was not a mine cave-in or a tornado or, combat. It could be, but usually it's not that stuff. It was person to person, right? Someone hurt them, someone exploited them, someone scared them. And what is the way that the human brain experiences the world as safe? And it gets all those thinking functions back online. How do we turn off the smoke detector that's going wah, wah, wah for hours? How do we do that? One of the fastest ways to do that, one of the most powerful ways to do that, is based on how our brains developed. When newborn humans are born, the thing they are driven to more than anything else is connecting to that caregiver, right? If any of you have ever been around a newborn, their grip is so strong, you can lift them. Don't do that. It freaks people out. But we evolved, we are born to connect to another human being and hang on for dear life. And what does that infant want? the caregiver's face, the caregiver's smell, food, snuggling, comfort. We are built to connect to other human beings. And one of the fastest ways to get the alarm system to shut off and to say everything in the environment is okay is through connection. Right? We may connect in different ways. We may feel comfortable with different ways people are trying to connect with us, but that sense that another human being is close, who cares about us, and that we're safe with is one of the fastest ways to get the amygdala to calm down and stop sending out that signal that releases the norepinephrine and the cortisol in the brain and releases the adrenaline in the system that knocks us up into hyperarousal or knocks us down into hypoarousal. Connection. But here's the trap. What if the thing that helps me connect, the thing that helps my brain start thinking, the thing that helps me have a different experience so that the water can flow this way instead of this way and the damage can start to grow over and heal, the thing that helps me to do that the most is the thing that hurt me in the first place, people. That is the paradox. That is the trap that a lot of you are caught in when you are working with these people. It's because the thing that is going to help them the most to help get their brain back online, to be able to think, to have a different experience over and over and over, which is how the brain heals, is at least inform the thing that hurt them. Imagine that you nearly died from being poisoned, and now, for some strange reason, the thing that's going to help heal you looks a lot like the thing that poisoned you in the first place. That's a terrible dilemma. It's really stressful. And so it takes us longer, and we have to be more patient to figure out how to make this safe for people. And to get back to the question way before about manipulating, if we kind of take it out of that context and we just say, this person has to be taught over and over and over again that people are safe and will help them get their needs met. That's a much more, not just kinder, but more accurate way to describe what you're dealing with. And I know it's a huge pain and a huge struggle with what we would normally call, the shorthand is manipulative. So, Nicole, I hope that answers your question about medication 20 minutes ago when I started answering it. And Patty, I do want to answer your question because I'm looking at it. Would excessively apologizing, even when they've done nothing wrong, be considered fawning? Yep. What's the best way to react to that? I tell my client he did nothing wrong and explain what is happening and reassure him. I think that's great, number one, but probably the most important thing that's happening is you are communicating to him that you're safe. Every time, what you may want to think about is, saying, hey, it's okay, you don't need to do that. That's good. Where you're really trying to go is, I'm just going to call him Joe. Joe, you're safe right now. Because the fawning is triggered when he's gone into that hyperarousal. If we're right, if it's fawning, if it's a trauma reaction. And the first thing that needs to happen to get the action to change is the amygdala needs, the fire alarm needs to be shut off. And the way that happens is when someone feels safe. So even if you don't talk so much about, you don't need to do that, it wasn't your fault, which is a very thinky thought kind of thing. If you just say, hey, Joe, I really like being here with you. Everything's cool right now. You're not even necessarily talking about the fawning as much as you are saying, Joe, you're safe. And what will happen is, if our guesses are right, then his brain will start to go, oh, I can shut off the smoke detector. And now he will start coming back into range. That's what we're going to talk about more in a second. So this is a good time to get back to the slides. Thank you guys for these questions. I know there are a bunch I'm not getting to, but I always feel like these take us more where you guys are interested in going. Okay, so I'm going to shut this down, but we'll come back to some of those. I also know we took our break at kind of a weird time, but if you need to get up and walk around, please do that. So much to do, not enough time with you guys. Okay, so we've talked a lot about these things. This is the last thing I want to talk about before we talk about trauma responsive care and how we get to getting ourselves into a good position to be properly responsive when someone may have been impacted by trauma. I love this quote. Those of you in the kid world, you may know this name. He is probably the preeminent childhood trauma person in the US. Bruce Perry out of Texas. He did a lot with neurological mapping for kids with trauma. But anyway, this is what he says that I think is so helpful for us in the DD world, also in the education world, kid world. This is something that I think is really important to keep in mind. People usually want to teach other people from the top down, but the brain actually works from the bottom up. Yeah. Again, our paradigms for the brains are shifting a little bit, but essentially it's mostly right to say that, you know, a lot of that body function is in the brainstem. A lot of that alarm detection and sorting out sensory information is in the limbic system and the amygdala. And a lot of the, as I very scientifically call it, the thinky thoughts are at the top of the brain. So when we are dealing with someone, and if it's okay, Patty, I'm going to use your question as an example, although yours is, I think, a very nice supportive example compared to what people sometimes get. When we are dealing with another person, we are, it's a thinking problem, especially if they're doing something that is unsafe, or we want it to change, or they're freaking us out. Then we're thinking, what are we going to do? And typically we try reasoning, explaining, right? So to use your, again, rather nice example, Patty, I'm just going to explain to Joe, hey, Joe, you didn't do anything wrong. You don't need to apologize to me, which is right. But it also, it's a logical process, right? Oh, if I'm not the one who did something wrong, I'm not the one who needs to apologize. You get it. But if the reaction, if he is in a fawning state, it's because the middle of his brain was going, wah, 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 I'm unsafe, this person's mad, that's dangerous, I need to make them feel better, apologize, 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 wah, 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 right? They're in their hyper-aroused state from the middle of the brain, sending out that alarm signal. Travels down from the bottom of the brain to the body, releasing adrenaline and cortisol. You can probably almost see Joe get agitated and worried. Okay. Now imagine that for some reason, Joe, instead of going into fawning, becomes aggressive. You might say, Joe, if you don't put that chair down, you're going to lose your privileges, blah, blah, blah. Consequences and things like that are not bad things to explain, but the problem is his thinking brain that can go, oh, I don't want to lose that privilege, I should stop doing this thing, is largely shut down. Just like if you were in a building where there was a deafening fire alarm and there was smoke rolling in under the door and fire trucks screaming down the street, you would not do well on a math test, probably, right? Because the thinking brain is largely inactive. The brain and the body is completely focused on getting safe. And this is why we say that trauma responsive care is making people feel safe, connected, and in control. The first and the last one we've already talked about. Feeling safe just means the amygdala looks around and goes, oh, things are okay. You're turning off the fire alarm. That just makes sense. In control means I can be thinking enough to choose among options. I can choose to set this chair down or throw it or do whatever, right? And that's where we want people. In control doesn't mean I'm the boss of everyone. It means I can evaluate how I want to get this. The question about the person who is manipulative, if we're correct that it's driven by fear, then when they feel safe and their brain is able to think through, well, the last time that I took my clothes off, I got in trouble. And actually, it seems like when I ask for this, then this person's safe and I might actually get it. I'm going to try that. Safe and in control. The fastest way to get them there is connection. Remember, I talked about that is the first thing our brains are built to do when we're born is to seek that connection. The reason for that is chemical. And I'm going to talk about this briefly and then jump into the calmer skills. I said that when we're afraid, that our brain releases norepinephrine and cortisol, among other neurotransmitters. Those are the things that will signal the body to keep itself safe by going into fight, flight, freeze, fawn, or to shut down, right? So it kind of launches the sequence. Norepinephrine and cortisol. That's the on switch for fear in the brain. We need it. Fear is really important. It keeps us alive. Fear is not a bad thing. But anytime we can turn something on in the brain, we can also turn it off. Otherwise, I would start to scratch my nose and never stop. And in fact, some neurological disorders like Parkinson's involve stopping and starting. Things get kind of sticky. So if the on switch for fear is norepinephrine and cortisol, the off switch is dopamine and serotonin. What that literally means is that when your brain starts releasing dopamine and serotonin, it will actually chemically break down the norepinephrine and the cortisol in the brain, and your brain starts to get flooded with dopamine and serotonin. And that signals the amygdala to stop sending out the alarm signal. It stops sending the signal to the adrenal glands to pump out all that adrenaline, and we come back into range, right? So how do people get their brains to release dopamine and serotonin? Well, over the past 2 years, many of us have been delving into that, right? So things like shopping, or Wordle apparently is a thing, or sex, or cocaine, or sugar, or all the things that people like, essentially, will stimulate the production of dopamine and serotonin in the brain. But among the fastest and most powerful, if not the fastest and most powerful way to do this is also from Bruce Perry's work, by the way, is connection. When we feel that we are in the comforting presence of someone who loves us and cares about us, our brain will produce dopamine and serotonin, and that is among the most powerful ways to get a human brain to do that. How we experience that may differ, right? If I'm on the spectrum, I maybe don't want you to give me a big bear hug, but I still probably want some form of recognition and validation and connection. So when we talk about trauma responsive care is the next step from trauma informed, I kind of know trauma exists, to, okay, what am I going to do with it? Trauma responsive care is about making people feel safe, connected, and in control, in that order. The very first thing I need to do is to help someone feel safe. So if Anna's about to throw that chair, I'm like, Anna, hey, whoa, wait, it's okay. It's okay, you're safe, Anna, it's okay. Now that may sound really weird because Anna's making other people unsafe, but the first thing I need is for her brain to be able to start thinking, for her to be able to choose among her choices, which is real behavior, by the way. So the very first thing I want to do is do whatever I know helps Anna feel safe. Maybe it's me moving closer, maybe it's me backing up, maybe it's eye contact, maybe it's not. It might be simply just saying, Anna, you're okay, you're okay, you're okay. I want her to get to the point where her thinking and feeling and alarm system brain are all working together at the same time, and she's back in that window of tolerance. She's not over or under responding to her environment. The fastest, most powerful way to get her there is to help her feel connected. So if we have a relationship, that's easier. But if you've ever been in a situation where you've been in an emergency room or a crisis of your own or something, you probably know that it doesn't take much. Someone talking to you in a kind, reassuring voice, even if it's someone you've never met before, that sometimes can be enough for you to go, I'm going to be okay. This is going to be okay. So even if I've just met Anna and I can say, Anna, it's all right. I'm going to stay here with you. We'll get through this together. If that helps her to feel connected, her brain will start releasing dopamine and serotonin. Dopamine and serotonin will break down the chemicals that are stomping on the alarm button, right? And then her brain will start to integrate and she can start to feel more in control and identify among choices or options or whatever whatever the top of her functioning typically is. So moving into the calmer skills. What are the calmer skills? The calmer skills are how we work with ourselves to be able to figure out what Anna needs to feel safe, connected, and in control. And by the way, who do we try to help feel safe, connected, and in control? Everybody. Why? Because estimates of trauma in the DD population, when you put both together, big T and little t, are above 90%. So for my money, what is 90% of a population? Basically everybody. And we know that there's trauma we won't see, that however much we're looking for that big T trauma and we're getting better and better at it, which I love, there's still going to be some that we miss because we don't have the history or because they didn't report it or they weren't believed or whatever. And I've seen multiple instruments that can assess for potential big T traumas. I've never seen an instrument that counts how many times a day someone feels unloved or unvalued. Maybe someone will invent one. I haven't seen it. So we treat it like a universal precaution. We treat everyone as if. We are all very familiar with this now, right? The whole concept of masking, for example, is I don't know if I'm sick. I don't know if you're sick. We're going to act as if we could make each other sick. And if we don't, not to get political, but just logically, the effort of putting on a mask is less cost than the cost of a hospitalization or a life-threatening situation. So mathematically, the smart bet is I'm going to treat everyone as if. When we're talking about people with developmental disabilities, we treat everyone as if they need to feel safe, connected, and in control all the time before we ask them to do anything else. And for that, 8, 9, 10% of people who luckily had no significant traumatic stress, great. Who doesn't want to feel safe, connected, and in control, right? So how we do this has to take into account that we're humans and we have our own window of tolerance, which is that middle zone. We can get knocked into hyperarousal or hypoarousal. We have our own histories, our own stressors, especially over the past 2 years. Many of us are right at the top of that window a lot of the time. And it doesn't take much to knock us out of range these days, right? So the calmer skills are not about fixing someone or changing someone. It's a set of skills to help us get back into our window of tolerance. When I'm in my window of tolerance and I'm not triggered, or I'm not shut down, or I'm not angry, or I'm not in a power struggle with Anna, then I'm more able to do whatever it is I've already learned that is helpful to her or works with her to help her feel safe, connected, and in control. So jumping into that, oh, come on, slide. Here we go. So much stuff. Okay, we're going to talk about these very quickly, and I'll talk about where you can learn more, and we'll come back to some questions as we wrap this up. Checking in, really, you can think about that slide I had previously with the different ranges of when I'm in range, when I'm hyper-aroused, when I'm hypo-aroused, what are my sensations, feelings, and thoughts? What are my thoughts, feelings, and sensations right now? And the next step after checking in and asking that question is whatever the answer is okay. And this, again, sounds easy, but can be hard to do. My experience is that many of us, and I want to address the men in the group today as well, but I know this is a big issue for a lot of women, is we often are very harsh with ourselves about how we think we're handling something, how we should be emotionally available, how we should be reacting. And really that just keeps that stress cascade going. So not only is it a little bit mean sometimes, but neurologically it's going in the opposite direction. If I can say that if someone is triggering me or freaking me out or making me super frustrated or whatever, and just accept that it's neither good nor bad. How I act on it could be, but the fact that I'm a human with emotions is inherently okay, then I'm already partway down that road of coming back into my window of tolerance, right? I'm not increasing my stress by getting mad at myself for how I'm feeling. I worked with teenage gangbangers, criminals, I love them, usually felt fine. There is a certain kind of woman, older woman, if she's yelling, that will freak me out. So I don't have to feel good or bad about that, but I can accept that and go, yeah, I feel pretty triggered right now with what's happening. That's okay. And again, these two steps can kind of happen at the same time, but the next step might be trying to be lovingly kind to myself, trying to connect with myself in the way that I might be trying to connect with this other traumatized person to release that dopamine and serotonin. It might just be saying to myself, that's okay. This can be really scary. I have a colleague whom I just adore who once said, I don't know what it is, but if a client bites me in the face, I have a hard time with that. I get really upset. It's like, yeah, man, I guess I share that. If someone bites my face, I probably am going to get upset too. So lovingly kind might be taking care of myself in that moment, right? Excuse me, I have to go see the nurse. I've been bitten in the face. It might be something simple, like if my blood sugar is a little low and I'm getting cranky, I can be really critical of myself about that, or I can just eat something or take a breath or step outside, or find my coworker who I know is supportive. It might just be saying to myself, I'm trying really hard right now and I'm doing a good job. That could be lovingly kind, but it's still that releasing dopamine and serotonin rather than continuing the flood of the norepinephrine and the cortisol. Mindful, this is a word that gets thrown around a lot, but the first half of Calmer, we've really been working on sort of like turning the tide a little bit in our own stress chemicals. Now we're turning our gaze outward. Mindful in this sense just means what's actually happening and what's not happening. If you think about times when situations have escalated into an incident report or an unusual incident that you've had to write up, if you know, a family member or a staff person or someone was involved, chances are at some point somebody dug in and there was a power struggle at some point, or someone overreacted. When I worked at a community center, one of the places I worked, we called the police frequently because there's often stuff happening. And I learned right away that if the police came in relatively calm and just kind of, you know, trying to ask questions and figure out what was going on, chances are the situation was going to be resolved peacefully. If they came in kind of revved up and barky and, you know, then probably someone was going away in handcuffs. And that's not a critique of the police. I think that's more about how human brains work. But when we are overreacting, you guys know that's when everything blows sky high, right? So there's a difference between taking reasonable precautions and overreacting. And if you talk to that staff person or that family member later and say, huh, why did you do that? Why did you escalate like that? They'll typically say, well, I was worried that ... was going to happen. So let's say that I run, that I'm an individual and I take off out the door when I get sufficiently agitated and upset. And Kevin notices that I'm muttering and I'm pacing, and those are things that he knows sometimes are signals that if he keeps going, I might run. Does it make sense for him to position himself by the door in case I take off? Yeah, absolutely. Does it make sense for him to run across the room and tackle me? No, because that wasn't happening yet. Maybe that's what was going to happen. Maybe it wouldn't. Mindful just means take precautions if you need to, but don't overreact and don't underreact. Deal with what's happening, not what we are afraid is going to happen. Express, again, is something that I think we've all been grappling with over the past couple of years, which just means this is hard work and it is really stressful. And especially if a situation is challenging for us, find a place to let that stuff out. That might be on your shift, that might be with your colleagues, that might not be possible if you work alone or if it's not available to you. You might be someone who does that easily in their life, or that might not be something that you're used to doing. If there's one thing I can challenge you all to do as you leave here today, it's to think about, where does all of this go? And some of us who are helpers, it's hard if we think, oh, I like giving help, but I don't really want to get help. But help might not be a bad idea. That might be professional help like therapy. I personally have found therapy helpful at many junctures in my life as a therapist. Or it might just mean I really prioritize that time with my supportive supervisor or my friend or wherever it is, even journaling that lets some of that out. And then finally, responsive. Now, you might run through these steps very quickly in a matter of seconds, right? Just take a breath and then deal. Or it might be something where you need to really process and allow yourself to get the self-care that you need, and then go back to a situation and talk about what needs to be changed or what needs to be addressed, or how you want to deal with it. So this could be a few seconds, or this could be a long process. But these are things that we do to get ourselves back in range, even just a little, right? It's not a magic wand, and you don't have to be perfectly regulated. But when we get back into our range, then we can be present and available to help someone else feel safe, connected, and in control. And when that happens often enough, I don't know why that slide jumped, but I'm going to move that ahead. When that happens enough times, then it's like we're digging a different path in the yard, and the old paths the grass is starting to sprout up. and given enough time, maybe you'll always see the marks there. People have asked me, do brains ever change so much that it's like the trauma never happened? And my answer is always, I don't know. I think there are some traumas that are so severe or so chronic or happen so early that maybe that's always going to be part of their makeup or how they might initially react to things. Maybe that's something they'll always work with. But I also know that there is no limit to the capacity of the human mind and human beings to heal and grow. And every time they get that experience, Patty, I'm going to use your question as an example. Every time you talk to Joe, whether he ever understands how apologies work or not, every time he feels safe with you, every time you help him interact with you in a different way, then you are helping his brain to have a different experience. And over time, that's what heals. Medication, treatment, therapy, interventions, reward systems, blah, blah, blah. Those are all great tools. Great. And when they're applied sensitively and it's the right plan for the right person, they can be incredibly helpful. But that's not what changes brains. What changes brains is experiences. And when those experiences are happening in a caring and safe relationship, then that's how people's brains feel safe, connected, and in control over and over and over and over and over. And that is why I always end with this from the late, great Irvin Yalom. All the stuff that we can offer people, all these different interventions and assessments, those are all great, but it's the relationship that actually heals. And that's why it's so important that you guys are here today, because whether you're the person directly that they're interacting with, or you support the people that are doing that, or you're on a team, or you're working with a family, you often are the best chance our individuals have to begin to heal from, in some cases, unthinkable traumas. And for that, I thank you. And I also want to thank you for your time today. I know we had some interesting things happen in the course of doing this presentation, but I very much enjoyed getting the time with you guys. I will take some time for questions, but I also want to be respectful if folks need to jump off. So thank you guys for everything you do.
Yeah, thank you so much. Just tons of positive comments. I'm like other people, I'm like sitting here just like glued to the screen trying to get it all in and think about all of this. If you haven't signed up for part 2, it's the 10th of February, I believe. Does that sound right, Laura?
I think so, yes. And before everyone jumps off, Kevin would very much like me to mention that the book over my shoulder here is a book that goes into much more detail about all of this stuff. It's called The Way Through, and you can get it on Amazon or at NAD, or you can also go to our website. Kevin will talk about it in February as well. Okay. But I need to remember to say that.
I will. I'll include that when I send out the attachments with the CE and things like that. I'll make sure I include that in there.
Oh, thank you, Anna. You're awesome.
You're welcome.
Do we have a minute for a couple questions?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, I wish I had time to do all of them. Let's see. Yeah, really, I could spend days with you guys talking about this stuff. Let's see, from Dina, cognitive dissonance seems to play a role in disconnection from rational thought processes, correct? That is a really good question, Dina. And of course, we don't really have time for me to get into it, but my quick answer to that would be, I think that those are actually a little bit different. Cognitive dissonance could create some of that, but there are plenty of situations in which we're not really talking about cognitive dissonance the way I think of it clinically. Academically, there might be more overlap. So I guess my answer here is it can, but it may not always be a helpful construct, I think. Megan, can you speak to the diagnosis of RAD and helping re-experience safety when said trauma was experienced very early in childhood? Yeah, I will say that people who work with reactive attachment disorder, RAD, are American heroes, or heroes from around the world. And it is extremely difficult to work with. When people have experienced extreme levels of neglect, which is often where we see RAD, we tend to think of abuse in childhood. Neglect is sometimes more damaging to the brain. And there may be cases in which structures of the brain didn't develop. They developed insufficiently or not at all. Those are not great outcomes, but like everything else in the world, the earlier we get interventions, the better the outcomes we have there. But those are some of the most difficult um, things to work with in terms of helping the brain experience something different. If some areas of the brain, literally did not develop sufficiently, it's also challenging for things like fetal alcohol syndrome. However, having said that, there is no limit to the amount that human beings have the ability to change and grow. So will you get someone whose brain doesn't look at all like they ever had rad? Probably not. Can people's lives change? Yes. So I could talk more, but that sounds great. Kelly says, am I wrong? But it seems to me that just redirecting someone is useless for someone dealing with trauma. Oh, Kelly, I've got to tell you, kind of, yeah, I think so. I'm not sure I would say useless, but I think what I would say is redirecting in the way that I think you're using it implies that I'm making a choice, right? Hey, Laura, instead of focusing on this person who made you upset about what they said about Paw Patrol, let's come over here and play Uno. Ugh, I don't like that for two reasons. Number one, if I'm very out of my window, I'm struggling to feel safe or struggling to feel like I'm in my body, and redirecting me to another activity may require more brain power than I have at that moment. Like, oh, I need to do this and I need to go over here. Oh, okay, cool. I may literally not be able to follow your cues to do that. And bingo, now we've got a power struggle, right? But the other problem is this: too often redirecting really just means distracting. So yeah, if I'm getting into it with somebody and you can pull me over for a walk and a talk and we can calm down and I can feel safe and connected with you, that kind of redirecting, yeah. But when it's written in a plan and it's given by, it's being done by someone who's overworked and there are too many things happening and they don't get enough support, too often redirecting means bossing me around to do something or distracting me like I'm a toddler. And those two things, as I've said, I think are not great. So yeah, I'm going to agree with you, Kelly. Nicole says people learn and grow all their lives. I love that, Nicole. I could go on and on and on. So I'm going to stop here because I think we've still got some people on, but I want to be respectful of your time. This was awesome. I hope we get to spend more time with you guys. And Kevin, we'll see you in February. Anna, thank you so much for moderating this.